Western Civ 2, lecture number 13, World War I. World War I is a dramatic event that dramatically shapes the world, in that it involved many of the nations of the world, and results in the redrawing of boundaries and the fueling of animosities that will have a great impact over the next 100 years. It carries the moniker sometimes the Great War because of the extent of this war as compared to previous wars. There had been previous multinational wars that had gone on, whether it was there in Europe with the Crimean War, with all the nations involved, or in the 7 Years' War. There had been many spheres of battle around the globe. But this one is going to eclipse others. It is a modern war, and warfare is becoming more industrialized as there's different technologies that are brought to bear, and the horrors of this war repeat horrors found in earlier wars. It's just that the killing is done so much more proficiently, and it's in some ways less personal. So as we talk here about World War I, we recognize that we're in an even longer war than this war, as we're engaged in a spiritual battle, a great fight that's been going on since Jesus established his kingdom here on earth. But we're called to fight the good fight and to become overcomers. As we're here, there's tribulation that we face. We're not at home. We're engaged in spiritual warfare, not to kill people, but to undo the devil's dirty deeds and to win people to Christ so they can have the hope that we have. Anyway, back here to World War I. What led up to World War I? Well, the major factor that I would point to would be nationalism. Nationalism had also spawned imperialistic aspirations that we've seen, but as various nations dominated others, sometimes within their territories that they claimed, there were nations that aspired to have self-determination. They wanted their own freedom. So down in the Balkan Peninsula, the area north of Greece, you have a number of Slavic peoples who are feeling oppressed. Then up in northern Europe, you also have a group of Slavic people who are feeling oppressed, as there had been the kingdom of Poland at an earlier time, but following the time of Napoleon, in the aftermath of Napoleonic Wars, the kingdom of Poland wasn't reestablished. Instead, it was gobbled up by Prussia to the west, Austria to the south, and Russia to the east. And so the Poles, a Slavic people, have been under foreign domination for over 100 years, and they aspire to have their independence. Down in the area of the Balkan Peninsula, where you have countries like later Yugoslavia, you have Slavic peoples who are under the domination of the Austrians. The Habsburg family is still the ruling dynasty there, and they want to have self-determination. They don't speak the same language, there's cultural variations otherwise, and they aspire to have national independence. In the Ottoman Empire, there are several ethnic groups that aspire to be free from the Turks. Far away to the east, you have Persians who aspire to have their freedom. Down in Egypt, you have Egyptians who've gained their freedom by this point in time. But then in the area of the Levant, the area of Palestine, you have Arabs who aspire to be free from the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Empire is vulnerable in many ways, but it's still holding on, but it's going to disappear with the end of World War I. In England, there are people who also aspire to have their independence. The Irish desire to be independent, and they've long been struggling with the British over their control of Ireland. And so you have Irish Catholics who particularly want to be free from England and its cultural domination. So there's lots of nations that are within other nations that aspire to be free. Amongst the various nations that exist, there's also competition, as they've been out chasing after empire, planting colonies. You've had a scramble for Africa going on. Some countries had noticed that it wasn't going to be terribly profitable, but then they get caught up with this business anyway. The Germans are slow to get into this, as they've just been unified in 1870 along with the Italians. So they're going to be slow to get into the business of gaining colonies, and so they'll be beaten in the race by the French and by the British largely. But eventually they'll want their place in the sun also, just so that they seem like a powerful nation in the world. Beyond national aspiration, there's just economic aspirations for countries here, as some of them control the markets in those various colonies, and so they have a place to sell their goods, and also have a place whereby they can export people who can spread into less populated areas and alleviate some of their own problems. The nations of Europe at this point in time have developed various alliances. Many of the royal families are intermarried with each other. This is going to make for some interesting times, as we're going to find that from Queen Victoria, who had many children with Prince Albert, that the British are connected with a number of different people groups. And this sometimes makes for complications, but there are a number of military alliances which had been developed. And in something of a revolution, something that happened was the development of the Triple Alliance. Britain and France have thus far throughout this semester always been on the opposite side of a battle. But as we come into the first part of the 20th century, Britain and France, together with Russia, are part of the Triple Alliance. This alliance is a military alliance, and there's good trade relations amongst them also. On the other side, we'll see develop the Triple Entente. This is an alliance between Habsburgs of Austria and the German Empire and the Italians. The United States across the ocean is not part of one of these alliances. But there's lots of business that goes on with both sides of these alliances, and the United States, we're going to find, is largely made up of people who want to stay out of other people's wars and just enjoy good business and the profits that come with that. There have been some economic ups and downs in the United States, and people are looking for prosperity rather than expending a lot of money in war. The various nations of Europe have a very powerful sense of national identity that's been growing, and they've also been building up their armies. This is what great nations should do so they could protect the interests of their people. And throughout much of Europe, what we've seen through the whole semester is that Germanic peoples have long glorified war. The Romans had done that prior to them, and the Greeks prior to that. So there's a cultural glorification of war, that a person, a male particularly, gains identity by going off and doing battle, like those knights of old, and then you have something to talk about when you come home. And prior to this, most wars have been fairly short. Wars have been getting longer, but as we have standing armies, wars are going to be fought at a larger scale. And by 1914, the largest army in the world is that held by the Russians. They have a large population, and they have 1.3 million who are going to go to war in World War I. Germany, for its size, has a very large army of 900,000. Its army is very well trained and equipped compared to the Russians, most definitely. The French army is equivalent to the German army. The Austrians are smaller in population, and so they only have an army of about 500,000. And the British are the smallest of the lot. They don't have that largest standing army, and by the time the war breaks out, they will bring about 250,000 men to bear in the war. The British are going to have the largest navy in the world, so they're going to have some advantage there. The Austrians have something of a navy, as they have ports along the Adriatic, and the Americans have some merchant marine, but they don't have a large military force, but certainly a navy that's been growing and been developed under people like Theodore Roosevelt. In Europe, there's always the thought that there could be wars, and so war plans were drawn up. And a particularly important plan would be the Schlieffen Plan. This is a plan drawn up by the Triple Entente, whereby they agree that if any one of these countries, Germany, Austria, and Italy, are attacked, then the other countries will come to their aid. And in their planning for this, as they're anticipating a possible war with the Triple Alliance, they commit to protect each other, and the result is that the war plans for Germany would include making a attack on France. So if a war breaks out between Austria and Russia, then Germany's going to attack the Russian allies, the French. And basically what we have is we have the dominoes set up, where they're put in place, and then when the war comes about, then they already have a plan for what they're going to do in advance, and it's all set up. There's not a whole lot of thinking that has to be done. They've got a plan that's in motion. As soon as they hit the first domino, the plan's in motion. Things are moving to mobilize men and material. An additional factor that I would attribute to the First World War is the material focus of leaders of the various nations who are looking to the things of this world. Now we'll find that some of them are going to claim to be fighting on the side of God in this battle that's going to develop, but they're pretty much doing things by their might and their power, and only looking here in terms of realpolitik, the politics of reality that you've been reading about here, where they're plotting things, they're working out contingencies, and they're not thinking particularly about whether this is a moral operation that they're engaged in, or thinking about the horrors of the costs of war that's going to take place with all the casualties. As with any great fight, what you find before the fight, people will look at the tail of the tape. So let's look here at a comparison of the combatants. The forces of the Triple Alliance are generally known as the Allies. What we're going to find is they have some advantages. In their strengths, they have a very large industrial base, particularly when you bring the Americans into that calculation. Now, prior to that, the British had a very powerful industrial base. There's a growing industrial base in France, but when you bring the Americans into this equation, we're going to find they have a much greater capacity to produce war materials and to sustain resources needed to persist in battle. When you look at the population base, the Allies also have a great advantage, as they have large populations. Some of it's going to be located overseas. The British, for example, have as the crown jewel of their empire the territory of India, with all of its hundreds of millions of people. And so what we're going to find is there are going to be a number of Indians that fight in different parts of the world. Very famous fighters will be the Gurkhas, who come from India, and some of them will fight in the European theater of operations. The Allies also have an advantage in the area of resources when you consider their empires. The French and the English have empires from which they can draw various resources. And they have as a great asset domination on the seas. The English Navy is by far larger than the Austrian and German navies combined. And when you bring the Americans to bear on that also, they're going to have a distinct advantage on the ocean waves. So there are some advantages that the Allies have. Now, for the Triple Alliance, they're sometimes known as the Central Powers. What they have is they have very effective leadership of military and trained forces. They have superior generals in some ways. They also have highly developed technology, in some ways superior technology. They have a solid industrial base, as the Allies do. In Germany, they've industrialized a great deal. The Austrians and the Italians are not as industrialized as Germany, but they do have sufficient industrial base to supply resources. Another advantage they have is they have the interior lines of communication. Again, this makes them the central powers. They can fight from the inside out. Their trains can take things from one side of their territory to the other, whereas we're going to find the Allies attack from the outside in. As we look at the weaknesses on the other side, for the Central Powers, as I've telegraphed already, they have a lack of naval power. They also, in their military plans, make some miscalculations. They're basically planning for a very short, quick war, which means that if they get their resources to the battle fast enough and they win the war, they have pivotal battles, their enemies will capitulate. This is a miscalculation. They're going to have great successes, but they're not going to crush their enemy quick enough, and the result is, as the war drags on and it becomes a war of attrition, they do not have the capacity to survive. The Allies, an area where they're weak, is that they don't have the same kind of standing armies. The British haven't had a large standing army like the Germans, and the result is that they're not able to mobilize quite so quickly. And as we have these Allied forces working together, there's going to be difficulties at times in cooperation. Sometimes it's because they speak different languages. Other times because of nationalistic pride. Soldiers of one group don't want to be fighting under leadership of another group. And so there's going to be difficulty as they come to fight this battle from the outside in on Europe. And so we've got two interesting combatants with strengths and weaknesses. So let's then go ahead and think about how this war proceeds. As we think about factors leading up to the war, I've identified nationalism as a key element. How is it that this war gets started? What mobilizes all these troops and brings all these millions of men and war materials into conflict? The thing that happens is that there's an assassination. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia are traveling within the territory of what comes to be known as Yugoslavia, but it's the area, the city of Sarajevo. And as they're traveling there, the Austrians have dominated the area where there's these Slavic nationalists who aspire to have independence. And these Slavic persons are engaged in rebellious activities and the like, but the Austrians are dominating them. They don't have the same kind of resources with which to fight that Austria has. But as the Archduke comes to Sarajevo, there's an assassination plot. And Gavrilo Princip, a young man, assassinates the Archduke. This is the so-called shot heard around the world. Certainly the sound didn't resonate around the world, but the implications are going to resonate around the world, as this is going to be what starts World War I. We have an assassination. Now, you need to understand there have been a number of individuals who've been assassinated by anarchists, but this is a nationalist who's wanting the Serbs to be free, and so he kills the Austrian Archduke. In response, Austria makes demands of Serbians. But the Serbians make appeals to the Russians because they're fellow Slavic peoples. Their languages are similar, religiously, being identified somewhat through the Orthodox Church. There's some religious connections that exist there. So the Austrians make threats against Serbia, and the Serbians make an appeal, and the Russians respond. As they mobilize troops on the Austrian border, the Austrians mobilize troops. And as the Austrians mobilize troops against the Russians, because of the Schlieffen Plan, then the Germans mobilize troops along the Russian frontier. And they also are going to prepare to mobilize troops along the French frontier. The British and the French are not quite so ready for battle. And so their response is going to be a little slower. The British have to mobilize and recruit men and get them transported across the English Channel. And as a result, as the war breaks out, the British and the French are going to concede territory in France as the Germans are going to press towards Paris. The Austrians, who've initiated some of the struggles here, aren't particularly prepared, but the Russians, while they have huge numbers of men, don't have a whole lot in the way of military hardware, and so they're going to be vulnerable for that reason. The Germans, however, are able to drive deep into Russian territory. The result then is that initially it looks like the Schlieffen Plan is going to be working. The Russians fall back as the Germans press their advantage. The French fall back as the Germans press their advantage there. And so there's going to be some horrible battles, like the battle at Tannenberg that's fought in Russia, where the Russian troops are just decimated. You have lots of soldiers, they go off to war, but it's the sort of thing where you charge the enemy, and when the guy with the gun in front gets shot, then you pick it up and keep charging, because you didn't have one when you started charging. And essentially, there's a whole lot of men that are used as bullet catchers. Tannenberg is devastating for the Russian army and for its morale. In France, they're able to slow the advance, and this war of movement, we're going to find, is going to bog down and become a war of attrition. The British bring enough war materials there soon enough, they're able to stop the advance, and Paris never is captured. The German troops come within sight of the top of the Eiffel Tower, but they're never going to get into Paris. In this war of attrition, things bog down. Most symbolic sort of thing that people would identify with World War I are the trenches in the Western Front. Now, there'll be trenches other places also. This is not the first time that trenches have been dug in modern warfare. If you go to cities like Petersburg, Virginia, or Richmond, Virginia, what you'll find is there's still evidence of the trenching that was employed in the American Civil War 60 years prior to this war. And so this is not something that's new, and what you'd seen in the American Civil War is that Union troops were held off for a couple of years from being able to break their way into Richmond. There's an advantage to the defense when you're dug in. When you're on the attack, then it's difficult. You're vulnerable when you come into attack, particularly as the rate of firepower increases. So, in the Western Front, what you're going to have is about 400 miles of trenches that will stretch all the way from the borders of neutral Switzerland all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, there where the country of Belgium is located today. In this new war, there have been some new military hardware that's been developed that is going to lead to killing on an industrial scale. Amongst the new military technologies are guns that fire at a higher rate of speed. So machine guns have been continuing to develop. The old Maxim guns, some of those are still around, where they've developed strategies whereby they don't end up melting the barrels of their gun by having higher rate of fire. They will put water-cooled jackets. Sometimes you might see an old movie where you have a gun with a very fat-looking barrel with a little barrel sticking out of the end. This is essentially having water that flows around the barrel to cool the barrel, and so it's kind of like the radiator in your car. It's taking the heat away from the barrel so the barrel doesn't melt down. This is particularly when you're firing several rounds per second. If you ever touch the barrel of even a shotgun right after you might shoot it, what you'll find is you can burn yourself. When you shoot a gun over and over, the heat builds up, and with machine guns, the barrel will even glow in the dark if you're firing long enough. And eventually what will happen is the barrel will bend, and it'll become far less accurate and become something perilous. So they're developing technologies. The machine gun is a very important technology that develops, but since the time of the American Civil War, they've been having rifles, and these rifles will put grooves inside the barrels of guns, both those that are carried by individuals and big artillery pieces, and as a result of the spin that the projectile has, they become much, much more accurate. And so there are snipers who can shoot and hit targets from hundreds of yards away, whereas before you could line up in Napoleonic Wars and stand 50 yards away from somebody, aim into a crowd of people, and miss the whole group. If your projectile has a slight defect, it goes whirring off at odd angles. You could have duels with smoothbore guns and take 10 paces and both miss. With rifles, there's much greater accuracy. There's a number of other new technologies that are going to be used here on the Western Front, where there's going to be observation platforms. They had started to do this in the American Civil War by putting up balloons. Balloons will continue to be used, but now instead of waving flags and using Morse code, they'll have wire transmission, sometimes using telegraph up in the balloons, where they can look over their enemy's lines and see what's happening and report back. So they have basically a spying platform from way up in the sky. They look down on their enemy and see what the enemy is doing in their trenches and where they may be building up for an attempted breakthrough. Another piece of technology on the land is going to be the use of gas. Gas warfare is a nasty new way of fighting, where you can fill artillery shells with gas, and the gas of choice is a mustard gas, a chlorine gas. And what happens is that this gas, when it settles down, it tends to settle down on the ground where people happen to be, and it'll settle down into trenches. And as you inhale this gas, it will destroy the lining of your lungs, and the result will be that you'll drown in your own bodily fluids. So it's a horrible, painful way to die. And so in response, there's going to have to be the development of gas masks. What we're going to find is that gas is never super effective in helping to achieve breakthrough, because sometimes the wind blows, and sometimes it may blow the gas back on your own men. But it creates a new anxiety, a new item of equipment that soldiers want to have on the front lines, is to have gas masks which can filter their air and keep their bodies alive. If there's enough of this gas around, it will also eat in people's skin and cause scars that are quite terrible. So another nasty new development of using technology in warfare that's rather indiscriminate. If the wind blows and it blows that gas to a village, well, it could just kill the cows there and the people who live in the village as well. Amongst other new weapons that develop, you also have barbed wire. This had been something that had been something of a source of dispute on the American frontier, but as you have sticky barbed wire, it's harder and harder to move through the no man's land between the trenches. As we speak of trenches, I'd also have you recognize that what we're talking about here are lines of trenches. It's not just a single line, a single ditch, but they're in multiple layers, and you bring up your resources through these protected trenches. And as people have nothing else to do, they dig in. They dig deeper and deeper bunkers, and so it's going to get harder and harder to achieve a breakthrough whereby you can punch through and drive your resources through a hole in the enemy's lines. As we're thinking here about new military technologies on land, the use of machinery is something that's been coming along. There's going to be a whole lot of cavalry that's still used, and there'll be horses and donkeys and the like used to pull carts to bring supplies to the frontier. But they'll be using other forms of transit. They'll put in train lines so they can bring munitions to various places. They'll put large guns on rail lines at times, but that's something they'll do more so in the Second World War. As they bring resources, one of the new resources that will develop as they develop motorized vehicles will be the tank. The tractor is a new device on the farm as we head into World War I, and as you have mobile engines that are heavy and can pull things, they can pull great weight, which means you can have a lot of armor. You put enough inches of steel in front of you, it may be able to absorb the impact of a bullet. It may be definitely noisy, but this way you can, in a sense, have armed cavalry, and you can charge across obstacles. Tanks with tracks can mash over barbed wire, and soldiers can follow in behind them. With the configuration of the tracks on some of these devices, they can get across the deep trenches that others have. The problem is going to be that these pieces of equipment are rather slow, and as a result, practiced gunners will be able to take them out. So you use your artillery and you can knock a hole in these things. They have enough armor to protect them from bullets and small arms fire, but they don't have what it takes to withstand large artillery. They're also very prone to breaking down. Their machinery is prone to breaking down, but from within these tanks, you can basically take a protected position with you and that's mobile. And so basically you can drive a machine gun and an artillery piece close into your enemy. The tank is not going to be something that's efficient enough to really make a super large difference in World War I. It'll come along later in the battle, and we'll find that tanks become the necessary piece of equipment in World War II, and they'll continue to be a strategic asset up until recent times when tanks are becoming more redundant, as we saw in the Gulf War. If you paid attention to the news broadcasts then, they're in a tank. You can, if you're largely a sitting duck, if there's air power over the top of you with the right kind of munitions. But these are new, scary new weapons. Again, there's still people carrying sabers, and soldiers are certainly still equipped with their guns. They have rifles that they can put brass cartridges in, which aren't susceptible to the weather, and they have rifled guns, and on those guns they'll have bayonets, so that when they charge, you'll get down to fighting that's not so terribly different from medieval persons who are fighting hand to hand, trying to destroy their enemies. On this area of the Western Front, there are many attempted breakthroughs and some devastating battles that just take days and claim tens of thousands of lives. The two most horrible battles are the battles at Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. These are battles that claim tens of thousands of people's lives in a single day. Sometimes in an hour they'll take that many lives. They're trying to achieve breakthrough. So what happens is that they accumulate war materials, they get artillery pieces in place, and they have an area where they think their enemy may be weak, and they try to achieve breakthrough where they can punch through and then drive through into their territory of their enemies. These battles of Verdun and Somme don't gain 10 miles, and you spend tens of thousands of people's lives, and then within a few weeks things pretty much get back to where they were before. So the Western Front is going to be something of a killing field. Most of the time it's deadly boring, just waiting. You don't want to stick your head up out of the trench because you might get shot off by a sniper, so you keep your head down. But most of the time it's pretty boring. When there's action, it's horrific. But people, under the duress of just never knowing when something's going to happen, crack under that pressure, and there's a lot of trauma that is inflicted on people who will go back home different from the way that they came into the war. Coming into the war, people had generally been very enthusiastic, somewhat jingoistic, national pride, showing, fighting one another to sign up to go to war, thinking it was going to all be all done quickly. This was not going to be the case. It's going to drag out for years. The Americans, meanwhile, aren't involved in this war, and at least not directly. And the Germans and their allies want to get this war over before there might be the emergence of the Americans in the war. They'd prefer, of course, if the Americans would stay out of the war and supply them with resources and be a business partner. But that's not going to come about because of the naval advantages that the Allies have, particularly the British Navy. The way that they're going to fight against the Germans is that they're going to try to cut them off from their colonies and potential supplies by establishing a blockade. The Germans won't be able to get out of the area of the Baltic Sea, where they have ports, and they won't be able to get out of the Mediterranean, where the Austrians will be very quickly cooped up in the Adriatic ports. And the result is that this blockade is going to be very effective. In response to the fact that the British have greater warships, the Germans are going to develop a new form of maritime warfare with the use of the submarine. Now, the submarine had been envisioned much, much earlier on by people like even, I believe, Da Vinci, but the Americans had experimented with this back in the time period of the Revolutionary War, and the Hunley was an example of a successful Civil War period submarine. So these things have been developing. The Germans have motorized Unterseeboats, submarines. These ships have oftentimes artillery pieces, but the way that they usually are going to fight is using a missile that they shoot through the water, a torpedo. A torpedo that has a large explosive warhead driven by an engine that pushes it through the water at a high rate of speed, and as it comes into contact with the hull of a ship below the waterline, it will explode and hopefully, from the shooter's perspective, cause the enemy to sink. You don't have to be on the surface to fire this type of torpedo if you are within periscope depth. This is where you're using a mirror in a tube and you can see what's at the surface. So from below the surface you can shoot an unsuspecting enemy and you may sink them. So the U-boat is going to be sort of the equalizer for the Germans. These ships are much less expensive to construct than the great warships that the English have, and they're going to be a continuous threat during World War I. The Americans are kept out of the war because they know about modern warfare. Just 50 years, 60 years earlier, they fought this American Civil War, and there's still veterans who are around who know about that, and they know about the horrors of war. And this seems like a European conflict. Most Americans don't want to go into this war, and as the war had rumbled, President Woodrow Wilson had won election because he kept us out of war. This was a slogan that he will use along the way. He supports the idea of isolation, staying out of other people's wars. But President Woodrow Wilson is a scholar who has written a dissertation that deals with English law. He's got a high degree of regard for the English, and coming from a family where he's studied and taught at Princeton, he has connections with England culturally. And many Americans still have English connections, but there are immigrants from all over the place, and many of them are also Germans. And so there's going to be some concern, which way would this country made up of immigrants go in this battle? Would it divide the United States? Would Germanic immigrants identify with the United States, or would they identify with their nations that they came from? So there are divided loyalties that create a great obstacle to America's interest in the war. There's the economic interests. People don't want to go to war because it's going to cost us something. And there's the general impression that we just ought to mind our own business. We've gone off on some adventures where we've been successful, but we don't want to get bogged down far away in some foreign war. We have plenty of things that interest us here closer to home. America's been on a little bit of a military adventure down in Mexico, and there's trouble on the border with the Mexicans. As the United States has invaded Mexico, and so understandably there's some tensions that exist there. But while there are these obstacles, there can be some factors that contribute to America's interest in joining into this war. One of these is going to be economic. America has old ties economically with Britain and with the finance houses in London. And so Americans are going to be lending money to the British war effort and to the French war effort. This is going to tie them to that. Now, there's also going to be some people who want to lend money for the German war effort and to sell things to the Germans. But the British, with their blockade, cut American merchants from trading with the Germans. And there's certainly a lot of offenses that take place that offend some Americans' sense of sovereignty, where they can't trade freely with who they want to trade with. And so there's some hostility against the English also in this war. But there's just so many cultural ties as well as economic ties with the British. We speak the same language nationally. Again, there are pockets of German-speaking people within the United States, but there's a much larger English-speaking community. And the result is that there's something of a tendency to look towards the English. The English also have another advantage in that they control the transatlantic communication systems, the cables that cross the Atlantic. And so as a result, they're going to cut off most communications that come directly from Germany. The result is that they have the capacity to shape the way that Americans hear the news. And there's a lot of propaganda that comes about, where you hear about, Canadian soldiers being butchered, and innocent women and children being dismembered and raped, and the like, which are total fabrications sometimes. Certainly in the horrors of war, there are atrocities that take place, but they're out-and-out lies propagated, which turned American opinion against the Hun, against the Germans. They're made to be seen as the protagonists in the war. And the idea that the Germans were dangerous and might even be plotting against America was planted earlier on, but then the Allies fall into a great opportunity as they're going to gain certain information which they will make public. Now, American attitudes towards the Germans was certainly being shaped also back here in the United States by various editors who were pro-British. In newspapers, the Germans would sometimes make advertisements and try to spread certain ideas, and one of the ideas that they told people was that you shouldn't sail on the Lusitania. If you sail on this passenger ship, you're going to be in peril. And then what happens is the Lusitania sails out of New York and sails towards England, and in the Irish Sea, it's sunk by a submarine. And as the ship goes down, there's over 1,000 lives that are lost. More than 100 Americans are killed in the process. And the hue and cry is that, this is an innocent passenger liner that's gone down. It was a very large passenger liner, that's true, lots of passengers, but down in the hold were a large amount of war materials. This was not a completely innocent voyage that was going on there. It is really only in recent times, as the wreck of the Lusitania has been studied, that some of the extent of the cargo has been made known. So it wasn't a purely innocent ship, but there are certainly lots of innocent lives lost in the process. So why is it that a submarine wouldn't say, hey, we pop up on the surface, we tell a ship like the Lusitania, hey, stop, we're going to shoot you, get out, get in your lifeboats, we're going to sink your boat. The problem was that oftentimes what's going to happen is that merchant ships are going to carry guns that may be hidden on them, and a U-boat's rather vulnerable. If it gets a hole in it, it's going to sink. The Lusitania is sunk, and the Germans are made to seem as horrible barbarians who would kill innocent civilians who are non-combatants in a peaceful passenger liner. The great coup that brings America in the war, though, is the revelation of the Zimmerman telegram. Zimmerman is a German foreign minister who communicates with the Mexicans. In his telegram, which is intercepted as the telegraph lines go through Bermuda, it's an encoded message, but nonetheless they're able to break this code. What they're able to discern is that the Mexicans have been offered a deal by the Germans. If the United States comes into the war, if you will start a new front along the Rio Grande, along your common border, then at the end of the war, when things are settled, we'll make sure that you get Texas and New Mexico and Arizona back. Territories have been lost in 1848 and 1845, which were some of the very beneficial lands that made up Mexico previously and now become states in the United States. So they're offered territory if America comes into the war. And so when this is publicized, America will mobilize some troops along the border with Mexico, a border which before had virtually been a line on a map, now becomes one in which some towns are divided by fences, and there are resources there to make sure that there's not going to be an invasion from Mexico. So America comes into the war in 1917. America is slow to come into the war because we don't have a standing army. And so what we'll find is that America will engage in conscription. This is the draft. And eventually some 20 million men will be called up. And most of those are going to stay in the United States, preparing for a war and mobilizing. As men are called off to war and to war training, this is going to cause some social disruptions and also lead to more women working in factories and places where they hadn't been working before. So as the Americans are coming into this war, what's going to happen is that the war is going to go on longer because the Russians are going to leave the war. The Russians have been suffering dreadfully. They're suffering dreadfully because they don't have the equipment to go to war, they don't have the industrial base to make the equipment they need for war, and they're being led by people who come from the nobility. Nobility that may have nice feathers in their fancy uniforms, on their caps. They may have very shiny swords, but they don't know anything about modern warfare. And the result is that they keep leading Russian troops into losses, and there's a lack of confidence. The Tsar is preoccupied with various problems that he has. What we'll find is that he has a son who suffers from hemophilia, and this leads him to be distracted to some degree, but he's gone into war for which he's not prepared. And this is going to lead to a loss of confidence in the Tsar and eventually a revolution. We're going to talk about that revolution as we talk about the coming of communism to Russia in our next lecture. So I'll forego that here. But what happens in Russia is that because of all the military disasters, people want to get out of the war. As a result, there are political changes where the Tsar will abdicate. Tsar Nicholas II will abdicate, and a government will take over. There'll just be a temporary government. A moderate government will take over, and this is led by a man by the name of Kerensky. And the moderates are going to, because of nationalistic zeal, stay in the war, a war that they're not capable of winning. And this will lose them support because they can't mobilize fast enough to be winning this war. And this is going to give the Bolsheviks something of a platform where they're going to get Russia out of the war and stop that bleeding. There will continue to be bleeding, we'll see. The way that the Bolsheviks come to sponsor their revolution in Russia in 1917 is that Vladimir Ilyanov Lenin, a champion of Marxism, has had ideas through the years as he's lived in exile in the country of Switzerland, and he wants to, rather than seeing the proletarian revolution take place in the most industrialized country, he believes it can happen in his home country of Russia, that a revolution can take place there that might well spread across the world. And the Germans recognize this as an opportunity to divide the Russians. And so as a result, they will allow Lenin to leave Switzerland and to cross Russia. Now, to make sure that he doesn't get out somewhere and spread his ideas around, I said Russia, they're going to let him get to Russia. He's going to pass through Germany. So that he won't get out of his train along the journey in Germany, they weld the doors shut. He can't get in and out of his railway carriage. And so he's going to pass through Germany and eventually come into the area of the Baltic, where he's going to be liberated. As he's liberated, he has millions of Reichsmarks made available to him from the Germans. He's going to use this money to fund the construction of a printing press, which will be known as Pravda. Later on, you'll find that this is a commonly known word. If you ask your parents, they'll probably recognize Pravda if you speak of it. In Russian, it means truth. This is going to be the name for the newspaper that the Bolsheviks, the Russian communists, are going to use, and which will continue on for a couple of generations. As the Bolsheviks, the communist revolutionaries, are able to take over St. Petersburg and Moscow and take over the government, they have already made an agreement here that they would make a peace with the Germans. And so under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they concede a large amount of territory in Eastern Europe. So much of the area of Ukraine, Poland, all this wide swath of territory, the most agriculturally productive land of Russia, is conceded to the Germans. But as a result, the Germans stop advancing on Russia. This means that the Germans can then focus their attention on fighting on the Western Front, because they're no longer fighting on an Eastern Front. So the concessions of Brest-Litovsk mean that the Germans won't press their advantages there any longer, and instead they'll be able to focus elsewhere. And the Russian communists are going to be able to say, hey, we got us out of this war, which we're losing. They will subsequently be in something of a long-term civil war amongst those who are supporters of the Tsar and old imperialist Russia and the new Bolsheviks. But we'll talk about that later. As the Germans are able to focus on the Western Front, it makes the war drag out longer. As the Americans come in, now we have the Germans able to focus more attention on the Western Front. But the Americans bringing a great deal of enthusiasm from these soldiers who think they're going to tip the balance of power. Eventually they will tip the balance of power, but there'll be a number of long and bloody battles in the meanwhile. The Americans are also going to bring more air power to the scene. The Americans had developed the biplane with the Wright brothers flyer about 100 years earlier, but the Europeans have been exploring this, and this is another one of those new technologies I forgot earlier, so I'll stick it in here, where the airplane at first was a mobile device that I could fly far beyond the lines, unlike a balloon that I can tether within my own lines. With an airplane, I can fly miles over the enemy's lines and can reconnoiter what's going on and bring back information. So as the war begins, they're just observation platforms, mobile observation platforms. But as the war continues on, people who are in these airplanes sometimes decide to drop grenades on the enemies that might lie below and take the battle beyond the lines to their enemy. And as the enemies develop warplanes, they take pistols along and they shoot at each other in the sky, and before you know it, someone's going to decide, hey, we can take a machine gun and mount that on an airplane, and much higher likelihood you might shoot somebody that way. And so you put tracer fire, so every so many rounds you have a bullet that leaves a trail where you can see where you're firing. And eventually they'll, again with good engineering, you develop machine guns that will be able to be synchronized so that they shoot through a propeller without splintering the wooden propeller blade. They shoot when the propeller's blade's not there. They're geared so that they fire and the bullet flies through before the blade gets in the way. And so you can position your plane as a weapons launching platform, a machine gun platform, and there's famous battles that take place between flyers. Most famous flyers are probably the Baron von Richthofen and the colorful planes that he's going to fly in World War I. The Americans are going to bring new flying equipment, which will match up better with some of the Sopwith Camel. It's a type of American plane will match up better with some of the German engineered airplanes that have been operating with greater efficiency and consistency. So this war continues on for another year, and it's going to cost a great deal in terms of the number of lives. But eventually Germany is going to wear out. Again, the whole strategy was predicated upon a quick war, and they've fallen into a war of attrition, which they cannot survive, particularly as the Americans are bringing resources to the British and to the French, and the Germans are cut off from what colonies they have, particularly creating some critical resources for tires, and as they don't have access to rubber and some other resources that they need. In order to fight this war, these countries have engaged in total war. And this has a great impact on the countries that fight the war, as you have conscription, forced going to battle. If you're a male of the right ages, you're forced to go to war. And in terms of this war, sometimes people wouldn't usually be called to go fight for their country. Are going to be called. People who might be much, much older, who might have families, are going to be called into these wars. But everybody's going to get involved one way or another. The line between civilians and combatants and non-combatants is blurred, because people are working for the war machine, providing resources. Even children might be involved in scrap metal drives so that they can recycle metals that can be made into weapons. Or housewives can collect the drippings that come off the hamburger that they cook. And that fat is used in the making of certain munitions. So everybody's doing their little effort along the way so that the war effort can go on. At home, people will grow victory gardens so that from their produce they'll have food when there's going to be food rationing, and they can make sure that certain other foods are going to be channeled towards the troops, so the troops will have something to eat. As nations engage in total war, we'll find that they're able to get people to go along with the suppression of a number of the civil liberties which have come to be enjoyed in Western Europe. People have enjoyed in the United States freedom of the press, but if you speak out against certain things, well, maybe you're seen as engaging in sedition. You're undermining the government, and as a result, we're going to find that there's a number of civil liberties which are going to be suppressed. Certainly your access to certain resources will be suppressed. And one of the things that will come out of this is that governmental power is going to grow across Europe. And even in countries that struggle and pay a great price for this war, governments grow in their power, and people are going to be looking to governments to do more. This will be true in the United States, as well as Britain and other European countries. Governments are going to grow as a result of this war. Eventually, with the Americans coming into the war and the greater resources that are able to survive the U-boat attacks, particularly as they've been developing some new strategies for getting rid of U-boats, and they've been using more and more mines in the sea. This would be what in the American Civil War was known as torpedoes. The torpedoes in the American Civil War didn't move. They basically were submerged mines, explosive devices that could be detonated electronically or by contact. And they're explosive devices that are used to hem ships into harbors that can be planted. And there are depth charges that are developed which can fracture the hulls of U-boats. And there's a huge loss of merchant ships in the process, but America is able to produce ships fast enough that it can keep Britain supplied and overwhelm the Germans. The result then is that in Germany, the Kaiser is going to abdicate, and the new civilian government will sue for peace. As we come to the end of this war, again, there's just such bloodletting going on, and people are starving to death in Germany. People are weary of this war. The casualties continue to mount. The horrors of war are just costing more and more. And as there's a move towards the end of the war and discussions begin, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, has 14 points that he particularly wants to pursue. He wants to make the world safe for democracy, and we can see that within his plan certainly would put America in a position of strength. America will come out of this war in a position of strength. But under his 14 points, he wants nations to have self-determination. And so amongst his points, we'll have the creation of a country of Poland, which will be carved out of territory that the Germans have control of and the Austrians have control of. And this will be a source of later concern, as in the territories that are given to the new country of Poland, there will be a German-speaking and German ethnic minority, which will be oppressed at times or feeling oppressed in the land of Poland. The 14 points have within them probably a crown jewel that Wilson looked at in the establishment of a League of Nations, whereby war would be avoided in the future through the negotiation table. That war wouldn't be something that would be happening as regularly, that we'd make war a thing of the past. An armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918. This is why we still have that as a holiday today. This is when the Great War concludes. It will take some time. It'll take more than 6 months to come up with the Treaty of Versailles by June 28th of 1919. But under the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans will, and the Central Powers will take the blame for the war. They'll also be expected to make remuneration, to make restorations, to pay the price for the war. The British and the French have huge war debts where they owe the Americans billions of dollars, and they have economies that have suffered dramatically, and they've lost huge numbers of men, and their countries are reeling economically. They don't have the means to pay back their debts. And the Germans are in the same sort of situation, but the Germans are going to agree to pay 1/4 of their gross national product each year to pay back for this war. This is going to cripple their capacity to rebuild their country. America is going to be in a position where they're able to take over a lot of the industrial accounts that German factories might have otherwise produced, and that's something of a benefit to American business at this point in time. But the Germans are going to be under this cloud. They're also going to agree to limiting their military, to demilitarizing the area of the Rhine, and some of the territory that France and Germany had fought over, territory that Germany had won from France back in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, will be given back to France. It's very rich land, as far as you have a nice coincidence of iron resources and coal in the areas of Alsace and Lorraine and the Ruhr. These are territories that France will take over and will exploit even land that's in Germany. They'll take the industrial productivity of that land for a period of time to rebuild France. And so Germany won't have that resource to rebuild Germany. So Germany basically is not in a position to negotiate, and they acquiesce to taking the blame for the war and signing up for an impossible repayment schedule. That's going to plant the seeds of problems for the future. There will be a number of other treaties that are signed as this war is resolved around the world. The Ottoman Empire, which had allied with the Central Powers, will lose its empire, and Ataturk will create a new secular Turkey. But the English have engaged in subversion in various places, whether it was in the area of what is today Iran or the area of Palestine and Syria. They've engaged in subversion, and yet at the end of this war they're going to look to maintain control of these areas as protectorates under mandates. And so they're going to seek to dominate Iran and Iraq, and their empire will stretch then all the way to the Mediterranean, coming through the areas of what is today Jordan and Israel. The French will get the area of Syria, and so Lebanon and Syria will come under the French mandate. Now, at this point in time, the great discoveries of oil have not been made in the Middle East, but soon they're going to find that there's great resources that are there, and this is going to make it difficult for the British and the French to let go of some territories because there's resources there that they can exploit. The war comes to an end, but the implications are going to go on for a very, very long time. As the British had been trying to get the Arabs to support their side against the Ottoman Turks, they had sent the one-time archaeologist T.E. Lawrence, because he spoke Arabic. He basically went and lived amongst the Arabian tribes, and the British promised the Arabs independence after this war. And so they will blow up the railway line that the Ottoman Turks have coming to the area, and you can watch the famous movie Lawrence of Arabia sometime and see what T.E. Lawrence led. The Arabs have been promised Palestine, but then the British have also indicated to Zionists, to Jews who want to reestablish a state, that they were favorable towards creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And so they promised Palestine to both the Arabs and the Jews. Under the Balfour Declaration, they basically promised the Jews that they would be supportive of the establishment of a Jewish state there. The problem is that there's people who already live in the land. It doesn't have the same population density as back in Europe, but there are people whose families have lived there for centuries and generations, and they don't want to have foreigners coming to the land. But the Jewish people in England, some of them are very influential bankers, some of them are important inventors. They invest in the British war effort, and they fight alongside the British to support the war effort. And after the war, they're looking forward to being repaid for their loyalty. And the Arabs, as they fight against the Turks, are looking forward to gaining their independence. And this is going to set up long-term future conflicts in the Middle East. In a sense, much of what happens in Israel, Palestine, the problem lies with the British back here in World War I. There are a number of nationalistic movements. Some of them have been put on hold along the way, but when the war is over, then the Irish will think that, hey, maybe we need to get back to, instead of, we fought loyally, but now we want to gain greater independence. So in the aftermath of the war, there will still be a number of conflicts in many places, and these will not all be resolved by the League of Nations. One of the problems of the League of Nations is the United States, which envisioned the idea under Wilson, will never sign on because Woodrow Wilson will suffer a stroke, and the Republican Congress will not endorse the plans of the Democratic president. So the result is the United States is not going to become a signatory to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations is not going to be successful in fighting off wars. I've already given some impact of some indication of the impact of World War I. Vast casualties, millions of people's lives are disrupted, economic disruption. The United States has not been so greatly affected by this war insofar as there's no battles that were fought in America. And so this is going to put America in a position for world economic domination. We still have a merchant marine that's been enlarged. Some economic rivals are preoccupied in building their own countries. And so we're going to find that there's going to be some prosperity in the 1920s following World War I. But there's a number of different kinds of casualties. One of the casualties, philosophically, is the optimism that existed in Western society. Under the progressives, people thought things are just going to get better and better, and the world's going to get to be a better and better place. We're going to have heaven here on earth. But World War I pops that dream as people see man's inhumanity to man, and there's a great deal of pessimism that comes out of World War I. In the area of theology, we're going to find that postmillennialism becomes a very unpopular view at this point in time. There will be the creation of some new states, and so we'll see the creation of states, as I mentioned before, like Poland. Borders will be redrawn in Europe. New countries will be developed, and so out of the Ottoman Empire you'll have countries that would be the Kingdom of Iraq and the Kingdom of Transjordan and Arabia. There's a new power situation that emerges. Britain has been very, very powerful economic and military figure, but following this war, the United States is coming to have a greater role economically and militarily in the world. And so World War I has an impact that continues on today, as from the political negotiations and machinations of World War I, we have all the troubles that exist in the Middle East come out of that. Some of the boundary disputes that exist in the world come out of this time period, and World War I has a great impact on our society. As you think about our discussion of this World War and the impact it has on Western society, I challenge you to think again of, what are the important things that are happening here, and who are the major players, and what ideas are behind these things that develop. There are certain technologies that develop that are going to shape warfare, for example, for years to come. I'll be interested to see what all thoughts you bring to bear.